There are a lot of reasons to hate a character, and Game of Thrones is not short on examples. But what about when the audience isn't meant to hate a character? When they dislike a character not because they're evil, but because they're boring? Passive characters can wreak havoc on your story because they slow down the pace, waste time that the audience could be spending with more interesting characters, and they weaken the stakes because your audience simply stops caring. To illustrate this, let's use poor Sansa Stark as an example. We'll explore how to identify a passive character, the big writing fail that creates passive characters, and how Sansa Stark's eventual transformation into the badass Queen of Winterfell shows how you can turn a boring character into someone your audience will root for. Now, poor Sansa has a rough time in Game of Thrones, with a metric ton of bad stuff happening both to her and to her loved ones. On the surface, this might seem like a great way to evoke audience sympathy, but there's a big problem with the way Sansa reacts to these events. She doesn't try to fight back or run away, and she doesn't have any clear goals or ambitions, and she doesn't react to the plot. These are all signs that Sansa Stark is a passive character. Active characters have clear goals and motivations that they'll pursue throughout the story. They're internally driven and will respond to the events of the plot according to their own goals and personality. But passive characters don't be like that. They just have events happen to them. They never make events happen through their own action. Now, this causes problems in a narrative when you're trying to engage the audience. Because whilst you might feel sorry for a passive character like Sansa, feeling sorry for a character isn't enough to get the audience to care. In fact, if all a passive character does is suffer, it will actually annoy the audience. And the reason that this is annoying is because that character is failing the would they really test. You'll know the would they really test if you've ever watched a dumb horror film. Something terrible happens in a haunted house, the group gets a bright idea to split up, and then you think, well, that's dumb. Would they really do that? And in real life, sure, people do stupid shit all the time. But stories aren't meant to be like real life. Characters are dramatic representations of people, not actually real people. And there are rules for how characters should operate. A central character should generally operate at their maximum capacity. That doesn't mean they excel at everything, but it does mean that when a character is established as having certain qualities or assets at their disposal, those capacities should be available to them at all times and reasonably relied upon when trying to solve a plot point. So Sansa may be a young, vulnerable woman, but she's very intelligent, and being a Stark means that she's valuable and has political allies. The audience, therefore, might reasonably expect her to try and use those capacities to her advantage. But on the contrary, Sansa does nothing to exploit these advantages or try to change her situation in any way. She doesn't have clear goals that she's trying to achieve, and that means that despite the tragedy of her circumstances, she just ends up feeling passive and uninteresting. You might argue that her being so passive is a deliberate attempt to try and show how hopeless her situation is. But surely it would be more hopeless if she tried to escape, or tried to curry political favour, or tried anything to improve her situation, and then failed. Because doing that would make the audience care more about Sansa, because they'll see her struggling and failing against overwhelming odds. And to illustrate my point, just look at how Sansa's sister Arya responds to the situation. Arya Stark is peak active character vibes. When things go bad for the Stark family, she learns to fight, she goes into hiding, and escapes the Citadel, swearing to get revenge on the Lannisters. And what's the result? Arya becomes a fan favourite because she's tough, resourceful, and doesn't take any shit, while Sansa becomes a source of audience frustration. Now, I'm not suggesting that Sansa should become a swashbuckling rebel like Arya. They're different characters, and that's fine. But the point is that Arya responds to these events in the plot by following her own clear goals and motivations, and she utilises her own wits and physical prowess to their maximum capacity. Now that we've identified why Sansa is so passive and how bad that is for the narrative, let's see how the writers ultimately turned her into an active character so that you can apply that lesson to your own writing. It starts by giving her some agency as she learns to play the Game of Thrones from one of the experts. Littlefinger is a weird, odious man who's infatuated with Sansa's mother. And as Sansa grows up, it becomes clear that Littlefinger wants her as badly as I want you to hit that subscribe button. Now, Sansa is finally in a situation where she has leverage. At first, she responds in that typical Sansa fashion, passively going along with whatever Littlefinger wants. But then, he kills her aunt, and Sansa happens to be the sole witness to the murder. Now, as the criminal investigation begins, she chooses to lie to protect Littlefinger, slowly gaining his trust and then manipulating him into doing her bidding. This new manipulative streak continues on her journey back to Winterfell, as she convinces the Lords of the Vale to send an army to reclaim her birthright. And then later, she tricks Littlefinger into revealing his sinister plans, ultimately leading to his death. This new sense of agency makes Sansa a much more interesting character. The only flaw with her powers of manipulation is that they could have been hinted at earlier in the story, either by having her trying to manipulate people and failing, or by slowly succeeding at small manipulations and then building up to this grand payoff later on. So if you want to avoid making a boring passive character that audiences hate, make sure that you give your character a goal, even if they can't achieve it yet, and show them trying to achieve this goal at maximum capacity. And make sure they react emotionally and strategically to the plot, rather than having events happen to them or by them through the actions of other characters. But wait, sometimes it's actually useful to have a character that's boring. In the right circumstances, a passive character can make audiences more engaged with your story. But how do you know when it's the right time to have a passive character in a story? If you want to find out, just watch this video I made on Harry Potter, the world's most boring protagonist who just happens to be boring for a very good reason. Until next time, keep writing.